This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know, and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what?
All right, we're underway. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon.
Good morning, good evening, good everything.
What have you got in your hand there?
I have a cup of, I think it's decaf coffee with some hippie creamer.
Nice.
I
Sounds good.
I think it's decaf coffee because you provided it.
I did. And it goes with our, perhaps the topic of the day. The topic of the day is really about Hahnemann as the inventor of telemedicine. But we can't really have that conversation without really referring to regimen as well.
Well, and Hahnemann is the first naturopath, as I've heard you call him.
Well, clearly was, but we'll see how we go with that particular topic, and we might revisit it another day. There's lots of material there.
So much, but I think we need to address the fact that you've got two homeopaths sitting here having coffee.
Well, what else would we do at 11 o'clock in the morning?
Well, that's what we say, but there are those people that believe. So if this podcast is a little bit about myth-busting, so why don't we just kick off with talking about the funny ways in which homeopathy has been interpreted in terms of the things that you can and can't do, and coffee being, if I'm going to do homeopathy, I have to give up coffee.
Well, and
toothpaste.
Well, those are the two things I gave up when I first saw a homeopath. Because my homeopath told me unequivocally that those two things antidoted the homeopathic remedy.
Yeah.
And
I wish we had like a sound effect, like a honk or for when we do some myth busting.
Honk.
Honk. Why don't we talk about where that idea comes from?
Well, the idea, came from my homeopath.
No, I mean from Hahnemann. Not from you.
Well, it's interesting because where it comes from is, Hahnemann, and you've grabbed the organ on there, but I mean, of course, he wrote the book on the adverse effects of coffee. When was that? 1790 something? Around the 1800s, he wrote that article about coffee. Mm-hmm. And in it, he said, look, this is a pernicious substance. And but that's been misinterpreted because there are pernicious substances, but then what he's actually saying, I mean, really clearly, it's in black and white, is if you're in the middle of your chronic disease treatment, then a little less of this and this and this and this and this.
Yeah, basically. And so if we get to the organon, the footnote to aphorism 260 is kind of like the buzzkill footnote. The
footnote, is this the one where you're not allowed to
have anything?
Engage in swinging.
So I'm just going to read a little from
this. Swinging, people.
So the footnote to aphorism 260, and remember we're looking here at the Organon of Medicine, which is Hahnemann's philosophy book, which is written in what's called an aphoristic style, which are numbered paragraphs, and then he's got these lengthy footnotes. So he, for the most part, keeps the aphorisms themselves short and pithy. Which seems to be the preferred word when we're talking about aphorisms now.
I like 50.
Yeah, but also the footnotes then are these, big explanatory things. So the footnote to 260 is pretty fabulous. So first he says, patients with chronic diseases should avoid the following. And the first one, of course, is coffee. The second is fine Chinese tea and other herb teas. Beers adulterated with medicinal vegetable substances not suitable for the state of the patient. Now, that, I think, is a very important line because he says substances not suitable for the state of the patient. And before I go on to some of the other exciting things that you have to avoid, I think that's the clarifying statement there is that when trying to recover from or build vitality into the management of a chronic disease, you need to take good care of yourself. You need to take the strain off the vital force so that not only the medicine can do its work, but so that you've got the energy to heal. So if you've got, a condition where a caffeinated beverage is stealing from your vitality, if we put it in yin and yang terms, you're sort of banking on your yang energy and depleting your yin forces, which are going to be depleting in the long term and therefore not healthful.
That's interesting.
What do you think of that?
Well, it sounds pretty logical to me.
Well, that's good to know.
Well, it is.
Yeah,
Now, are you going to keep going with that? Because we're heading deep into a regimen.
because it's really fun. So he says,
But I mean, let's listen. Let's and break this down a little bit. Because the first thing that is in that paragraph is coffee. In the treatment of chronic disease, remove coffee. Are you on the treatment of your chronic disease right now?
oh, always.
Well, it's interesting because I'm not.
Yeah.
You know, I haven't had a homeopathic remedy since I last banged my head.
Yeah.
Which was yesterday, and I'm being facetious. It's interesting that coffee. If we just stick with coffee for a minute, that is the thing which I believe has been misinterpreted the most.
And mint.
Well, and mint was the other one, of course. I've every now and again got students to do a bit of research on trawl homeopaths' websites and look for all of the advice about taking the remedy, and it's extraordinary what some homeopaths have said about the evils of mint and coffee and the like.
I literally had a client once who thought they were not allowed to brush their teeth for the entire time that they were engaging.
Well, that would be
homeopathy.
possible if you had some of those West African
Right.
or East African toothsticks.
Yeah.
You know, those things. Oh, there we go. But additionally, what about our Brazilian and Italian colleagues? You know, in my own experience, trying to get people to remove something as critical, and even in America, you know, the way in which coffee is a staple. Now, it doesn't mean that doesn't have health effects, and it doesn't mean that it's not really is necessarily the best thing, especially in the quantities that people ingest it. But in terms of getting compliance, it's a really tough ask, don't you reckon?
Oh, totally. I mean, can you imagine really trying to get people to give up some of these things? Or, you know, if in countries where tea is a part of their daily ritual.
Right.
The question is,
Well, it's why it wasn't tea; it was fine Chinese tea.
fine Chinese tea, well, and other herb teas.
Right.
I mean, then all of a sudden, you know...
Celestial seasons.
Celestial seasonings. There goes your chamomile. Because what Hahnemann is saying is anything that is medicinal,
Right.
right? Anything that's medicinal that could lead the vital force in a different direction. He goes on to say, you know, the so-called fine liqueurs prepared with medicinal spices, all kinds of punch, spiced chocolate, many kinds of colognes and perfumes, strongly scented flowers in the room, medicinally compounded tooth powders.
Slow down. I mean, we've got to talk about these things. I mean, no flowers in the room. Are you saying that in the treatment of a chronic disease, Hahnemann's advice is no flowers in the room?
No strongly scented flowers in the room.
Right.
And
what was the
here's
one-
where, and this is where the toothpaste comes in. Somehow they skipped over the flowers and went to medicinally compounded tooth powders and tooth spirits or mouthwashes,
Right.
perfume sachets, highly seasoned food and sauces, spiced cakes and frozen goods like ices and ice cream. So you can't have ice cream.
Yeah.
Even a vegan sorbet would be off the table.
I don't think vegan sorbet existed in 1810.
They very well could have. But then he goes on to say, prepared with medicinal matters, e.g. coffee, vanilla, etc. So there goes vanilla. Raw medicinal herbs on soups.
In soups.
On soup. So like if you're going to put chopped herbs, a little chiffonade of basil on your stew, that's not allowed.
What about the dried onions?
Vegetable dishes with herbs, roots, or sprouting stalks, such as asparagus with long green tips.
Asparagus with long green tips.
Get this, hop sprouts, and all vegetables possessing medicinal powers, celery, parsley, sorrel, tarragon, all kinds of onions, etc. Old cheeses and meats which are putrid. I mean, I considered eating putrid food to be off the table anyway. Foods which have medicinal side effects, e.g. the meat and fat of pigs, ducks, and geese.
That sounds like pate.
All too young veal, sour food, all kinds of salads.
All kinds of salads.
So basically, what are you eating?
Well, hang on. What are we talking about, though? Because who's the client for which this is the advice?
The person who is in the midst of their chronic treatment. But I think it's a tough sell in translation.
Uh-huh.
You know, I don't know that we would be able to really do this in the 21st century world. But here's another thing. All of these are to be removed from chronically ill patients who should also avoid every excess, even that of sugar and salt, alcoholic drinks not diluted with water. So you can have alcohol if you dilute it with water.
Well, he had beer for breakfast diluted with water.
Yeah. Heated rooms, woolen clothing next to the skin. There goes all of that.
Base layers.
Yeah, all the merino base layers we've all invested in to get
Damn.
away from polypropylene. He probably would have said polypropylene if
Well,
it had
he
been
also
invented.
then goes and says woolen clothes close to the skin. Is that the next one? Or have you said that?
That's what I just said. Well, that's when you said about the base layer.
Yeah.
A sedentary lifestyle in closed quarters, or more often, only passive movement through riding, driving, or swinging.
Swinging.
Excessive breastfeeding. Long afternoon naps lying down in bed. Reading in a horizontal position.
Wait. Reading in a horizontal position.
Don't lay down and read.
Okay.
Only read sitting up or standing, apparently. Keeping late hours. Uncleanliness.
Right.
Unnatural voluptuousness.
Oh dear.
Here we go. Now we get into the sex part. Enervation from reading lubricious material.
I think that means bodice
Oh.
rippers.
I think that's bodice rippers.
Mills and Boone.
Onanism. Incomplete coition or abstinence from coition
Incomplete coition.
or abstinence,
Right.
either from superstition or to prevent the engenderment of children, pregnancy in marriage, so no birth control. Objects of anger, grief or vexation, passionate
sense.
play, mental or bodily overexertion, especially immediately after a meal, dwelling in marshy regions and stuffy rooms, penury, etc. Now,
And then the last sentence.
and then the last sentence, all these things must be avoided as much as possible or removed if the cure is not to be hindered or even made impossible. Some of my imitators, by forbidding far more, rather indifferent things, seem to make the diet of the patient unnecessarily difficult, which is not to be sanctioned.
Right.
Which is pretty funny, but can we just, it is somewhat comical in a way to think of this. You could just take it as best practices for health. What is the best way? I mean, we know so much now about things like anti-inflammatory diets and, and the like, but I think what's fascinating to me is that it's gotten boiled down in the 20th and 21st centuries to be coffee and mint.
Right. Okay, that's a very important point because, why those two or three and not the others? Actually, do you know what Hahnemann's attitude towards coffee also involved a strongly political stance? Because, of course, coffee was imported to Europe by the Dutch in the 1700s and 1800s. And so there was a movement within the German states. Remember, Germany didn't exist, so it was within Saxony. Prussia.
Yeah.
And the even those, over to Romania and Transylvania, Hungary, Austria. But that it was un-Germanic to drink coffee, and therefore they should stick to more sensible substances like beer.
Beer for breakfast, right.
Yeah. I think that's another feature which is somewhat, sometimes forgotten. But you're totally right. The overemphasis on these substances. So what's
weird.
the kernel of it, though? Because are we saying here that there's a piece of the organon that we're just going to laugh at and say, oh, that's pretty funny. It's a real old school.
No, I think we could do two things at the same time, which is to say, okay, this was a very particular interpretation of how one manages their body, mind and spirit, in order to be in a state to be able to deal with the unraveling of a chronic issue. And that's the 18th century, or 19th century sort of realm of specificity. I think we look at it a little bit differently now. I think we can interpret it to say that, we recognize that there are certain foods, we would call it, or at least, with my dealings with people with autoimmune disease, we would talk about an anti-inflammatory diet.
Talk about your culinary adventures.
Yeah, so back in, I kind of feel like we might have talked about this in one of the other podcasts, but
It doesn't matter.
So back in 2006, I moved from Minneapolis, where I'd been practicing, back to Philadelphia, and I had a lot of clients with real issues and not a lot of information about sort of health supportive diets, and this was before we talked about anti-inflammatory diets back in like 2006. And I, being an Italian foodie, I was all too happy to kind of jump into learning more deeply sort of medicinal diets. And I wound up doing a culinary program in New York. It's not around anymore, but it was called the Natural Gourmet Institute at the time. And it had been around for, from the late 70s, maybe early 80s, started by this woman called Anne-Marie Colbin. And she was really a pioneer in the food as medicine movement. And the school started off as actually a macrobiotic cookery. And I remember getting into macrobiotic cuisine in the late 80s. There was a macrobiotic restaurant in New York that I loved. But it was,
Only two customers, you and Yoko Ono. Right?
She continued to go there. I actually would see her there in the late 2000s. Anyway, but she... So the idea, though, was food as medicine, but also, learning how to deal with allergy-safe cuisine, which is not a concept that we really used to talk about.
Right.
Because there's a way in which we modern people, we are learning how to sort of modulate how we live through what we eat or what we don't eat. And it's become really clear. I mean, one of the things that got me to culinary school for this particular program was because I had so many kids in my practice that had food allergies and food sensitivities, So I would classify an allergy to be anaphylaxis or a severe reaction, and a food sensitivity or what's the word I'm looking for? Not incompatibility, but something like that. Food intolerance. Intolerance is the word. What do you do, especially if you're talking about a child? How do you provide a healthy and varied diet to kids who are naturally picky at certain, stages of their life? And so going to culinary school and sort of learning all the workarounds, how do you prepare a really, delicious gluten-free variety of foods? I mean, and again, we're talking 2006, 2010 when I actually went to the program, but the variety that's available now, I mean, you could go to Costco and get, cauliflower rice in the frozen section, right? Like these things, it's become so much a part of the sickness in, the developed world that we've had, people have had to remove so many foods from their diet. So the way that I would kind of translate the footnote to Aphorism 260 is to say, you've got to really look at the impediments to health and address them. And sometimes it's through, people do elimination diets, which I think are really hard. They're really hard on kids. But sometimes it's just removing the most offending foods, the most high inflammatory foods, like gluten, like, dairy, and then looking at the various allergies and obviously, removing those. So I kind of look at 260 through the lens of what are the things that an organism really can't tolerate or shouldn't engage with.
Right.
And when it comes, I really enjoy the 21st century view of the second paragraph where, the sedentary activities and don't read lying down. But what if we just translate that into what we do now? Like, don't look at your phone right before bed. How much screen time are you getting? How much activity are you getting in, how much Wi-Fi and 5G are you immersed in? How much fresh air are you getting? Look at the vitamin D3 deficiencies. So I kind of think that we just have to translate it. I mean, do you think that's fair game?
I do. I've often read that paragraph, and I must admit I've swung both ways, and I've said, this is serious advice, and we need to think about the advice. Actually, what I would like to do is kind of talk about Berninghausen's nutritional program.
Right.
Another time. I think that would be really good.
I think we should, because we should.
Insertion of good regimen.
Yeah.
See, this is about the removal of obstacles as people are, engaging in their health. So I think I distracted myself halfway through. I've also had a good laugh at most of them.
Yeah.
And then I thought to myself, well, hang on. Actually, if I'm ill, if I actually had symptoms like the last time I was ill, even with an acute condition, when did I have the COVIDs? Back in April, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The last thing I wanted was carrots and celery, and I couldn't read in bed,
Yeah.
And so, I wasn't trying to work or anything like that. I was just allowing myself to heal. I think, in that kind of context, good advice. You know, I
Yeah.
didn't want coffee. You know, I wasn't going to try and drink it. But in the treatment of a more normalized chronic disease, those things would be really tough. And I've often challenged students to not only give advice or give appropriate advice on the removal of those obstacles, but how would you go about it
Right.
to someone that is reliant on their coffee.
Well, I can tell a story about. It's a case that I teach to the fourth semester students when we talk about autoimmune disease, and a client of mine who had MS, and I say had because she was able to become asymptomatic. It was a 9-year process we worked together for, but anyway, her case got so much better when she finally got into a better regimen. She was drinking rum and Diet Coke, as her nightly beverage. And and so she got on a really intense regimen. And then the homeopathy was just so much better. But I think, let's talk about regimen, at another time.
I totally agree.
But I think it's really important when we think about if today's topic is sort of like, Hahnemann was a bit of a trailblazer in two areas, right? And where he's, he sort of he predated the sort of system of naturopathy as it turned out to be, but he advocated for many of the same principles.
Let me read you this letter he wrote to a client. It's a random letter. It's on page 16, Genius of Homeopathy. It's out of Francis Treuhertz's stunning book, Genius of Homeopathy. Hahnemann's writing, he says to a client, as I suspected, that coffee does not agree with you, and that you would do well to diminish your morning allowance to 1 cup. After doing so for 14 days, you may, for some length of time, drink a cup every other day, and after that, if possible, leave it off altogether. Instead, you can drink what you will, a couple of cups of boiled milk, or nothing at all, or a mouthful of water, but you should not use coffee in the way that you have been. As regards wine, I see very well that you must be moderate, but I do not wish you to leave it off altogether. All right, it's interesting. I don't want you to leave off your wine. As you no longer take the powders with their accompanying glass of wine, that's interesting, because that's implying that this is a 1805 letter.
Right, so he was giving the remedy.
So the remedy
with
accompanied with wine. You
like
may
this.
try at dinner a half glassful of wine with water. So water it down. And then there's some other parts about taking the remedy. As regards bedclothes at night, you should adapt the quantity to your feelings, but you should rather lie cool than hot. If you can avoid perspiring without much trouble, that would be advantageous. Now, that's so interesting because along with the pill comes the advice.
Absolutely.
And this is a lovely letter, obviously going back and forth, daily practice. But gee, some of his letters, oh wow.
Well,
I don't know that I can find any right now, but some of them are you kidding
stern,
me?
to say the least. So this takes us to our second topic.
Well,
which
we haven't
is,
got time to get into that second topic, let me tell you. I reckon that we need to think about the way in which Hahnemann dealt virtually. I think that's a whole
Okay, so why don't we make that our next? So our next podcast is going to be Hahnemann as the inventor of telemedicine.
I love it.
And this is, I think, we teach this at AHE. We really think it's an important topic because of how the world is changing, and the pandemic forced the issue. And so, I think it's going to be a good conversation to talk about how it came about from the very beginning, and when really good practitioners are, few and far between, given the demand for homeopathy, it's requiring people to, be available through virtual platforms. But we'll talk more about that next time.
So, but back to coffee and stuff. To, so let's get back to that and then finish that one off. Because I'm going to say, my question to you would be, have you got examples? You must have examples of clients for whom you've said, you've got to stop this and this and this.
Oh, 100%.
And their health status has improved and the remedies act better, right?
I mean, we could just look at coffee,
Right.
I mean, people with insomnia, should watch their coffee. I find a lot of women, perimenopausal, menopausal women who have significant, heart palpitations and hot flashes can do better to limit, caffeine, whether it's coffee, tea, chocolate. How many, every homeopath can count on, all their fingers and toes, how many clients who have sleep issues who are using substances that discourage good sleep quality, or don't have good sleep hygiene.
In the same way, have you had clients clearly antidote their remedies with coffee?
A few, but it's not like the norm.
In 34 years, I've only had one
Yeah.
client that antidoted their remedy with coffee.
Do you think...
I don't even talk about it.
Some people are super sensitive.
That's a really important point that people hear, though, because if you're listening to this and you're maybe new to homeopathy or something, maybe you're an old homeo, but weigh in and let us know, because I long let go the idea of antidoting homeopathic remedies with substances, and I think especially with the 5th or 6th edition style of prescribing, that myth, honk, we've got to.
We need a sound effect.
Yeah, we do, don't we? Maybe an old horn or something.
We need an old horn. I'm going to get you an old horn for your birthday.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's coming up.
Yeah.
But so I love the point you made, is that it's not that coffee's a benign substance. It's not. It has a massive impact on people's health, and so it's useful to leave off sometimes. But does it antidote? No, not in my experience.
No, because I think there's a bit of a fallacy with antidoting. First of all, don't get me started on, just take any remedy you want and then antidote it with Camphora 200.
Oh my God.
It's like Camphora, a remedy for icy cold collapse. It's a corpse revival remedy, has now become a sorbet course between protocols.
With the deepest suicidal depression.
Right, exactly. Like
the dark night of the soul.
Yeah, it's one of the nastiest remedies in the Materia Medica. Like how that became the sorbet course is beyond me.
Yeah.
But it's rare. I think that the more you get, I'll give an example or a visual. The way that I think of it is, if you imagine, now you're an archer, Alistair, so if you imagine the target and you say, okay, if the arrow hits the target at all, that remedy's going to act.
Yes.
If the remedy hits like a bullseye, it's really going to react, and it's going to be really difficult to kind of unseat it. It's like a vacuum, the remedy to the vital force. The further you get away from the center of the target and to the edge...
Which color is that?
I have no idea the colors. Is it red in the middle?
No, gold.
Gold in the middle. Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. That's quite alchemical. Mm-hmm. What color's on the outside? White? White. So if you're in that zone on the outside of the target, well, then the remedy is a little more tenuous. You don't have a complete energetic match. And so then it's easier to, I wouldn't say antidote, but to sort of knock it off. A remedy isn't going to stick as deeply. It's not going to hold as deeply, or it's not going to elicit the response from the vital force that we want. So I think when I look back and say, 20 years ago, did I have more antidoting issues than I do now with my clients? Probably because I was a mediocre prescriber, or I was a newer prescriber, or I was maybe getting on the target but not in the middle, right? So I don't know. I rarely see antidoting. Now I can imagine, because we hear students all the time, you hear these stories of I walked by a coffee shop and, antidoted my remedy, or, right. But you can also, I know I'm quite sensitive. I mentioned, Costco earlier, right? So twice a year when there's a party, I have to go to Costco. We're having a big party for our community next week, and there'll be a Costco run. And I know that if I walk down the detergent aisle, it's going to make me feel sick.
Oh, really?
Oh, I hate it. It just makes me feel sick. And so,
I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you for that. You want to go to Costco?
Oh.
No, me neither.
Hell no, I'm not going.
But if you think about it, now, is that antidoting a remedy, or is that just an effect? Right?
It's really, really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
A
lot to think about there.
I know. There's so many spin-offs to this. I think, if we focus, what we've done is we've spoken about aphorism 260 in the
footnote.
And I would love to hear people's stories. Everything in there. Have you found similar, identified similar things that we have over our period of time in clinic, or have you had a run of antidoting substances? I have seen more folks mess their remedies and their treatment plans with big nights out, with
You
a
always
lack
say
of
that,
sleep,
yeah.
and too many where I used to live, too many schooners of beer, too much beer. Like a big
Dental
night out.
work. I find dental work
interesting.
can be challenging for people,
Right.
or a surgery, something like that, where there's a big thing. But not a cup of coffee. I mean, I'm sure we're going to hear from people that'll be coming in droves.
Well, that's assuming that people are listening.
That's a really good point.
We're talking to ourselves.
Which we would be doing anyway. Now
I
we just
know.
do it with a microphone.
I know, it's just great.
Can I say, as we close up, some things that I'm excited about for upcoming podcasts is that we'll be interviewing some people. And
nice.
so I think it's going to be really fun to take the conversation outward. So we really appreciate that there are people who, just the way that people are interested in homeopathy again. And so, is there going to be the sound effect?
That's coffee, by the way.
That's the sound of Alistair pouring some more coffee. But it's great to know that there is such interest in homeopathy. And so
You know who we're going to interview?
we are going to interview Bill Shevin, the president of the Pharmacopoeia.
Mike Dong.
Mike Dong, our dear friend, who owns Similimum Pharmacy in Wellington, New Zealand, and we'll have some fun stories to tell. We've actually done some traveling with Mike Dong. We've got a little story to tell about when we were in China together. Who else are we
That story
interviewing?
would keep us going for an hour.
Oh my gosh.
And then you want to hit the folks at Drexel, right?
Yes, we will be doing an interview with my dear friend Margaret Graham, who is the Hahnemann archivist. The Hahnemann Archives are at Drexel University's medical school. We're actually taking some of our students and alumni there for a visit next Friday. So we've got a number of people, and then some other special guests that we just have to check on their schedule to get on the docket.
Farouk, Jennifer.
Farouk Master. Oh, are you thinking Jennifer Jacobs? That would be amazing.
Yep, Jerry in Australia. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Watch out, folks. We're on our way.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thanks for listening.
See you soon. Hey, take care. Ciao.